sure we'll have people trickling in, and that's fantastic. The more the merrier. They'll pick up whatever they cover. So thank you for being here. It's the season finale. It's very exciting for the Midwest Chamber Ensemble. It's been an amazing season. I've had the privilege of playing, I think, 4 concerts this season. It's been a really special one, and we're ending it with a huge bang, a whole orchestra. And, you know, it's a concert that revolves around the piano. Every single piece was either originally written for the piano or is a piano concerto, right? So that's really nice. And it's a little bit of a different concert for the Midwest Chamber Ensemble because, you know, kind of one of the things that we try and do is program minority voices, female voices, composers that are still alive. That's like kind of been our mission statement of something we do. But today, it's an entire concert of dead white guys. Well, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that's what we're doing today. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that's important and why we're going to talk a little bit about that. It also just happens to be 3 of the biggest names in music of all time, right? Beethoven, Debussy, Ravel. 2 French guys, Debussy and Ravel, and then Beethoven, the most famous musician to ever live. So it's slightly different for a concert for MCE, but in a really great way. So let's talk a little bit more about this. It's not a new problem that when you show up to hear an orchestra, it resembles more of a museum, right? The first person to talk about this was Aaron Copland, another dead white guy, right? Aaron Copland, one of the most famous American composers, wrote Appalachian Spring, a beloved American composer. He wrote a book in 1939 titled What to Listen For in Music. It's a wonderful book, meant for wide audiences. I would encourage you, if you love music, that's a book to go buy and read, right? It'll pay off when you come to concerts like this. There's an entire chapter dedicated to what should orchestras be playing, right? He says, this is in the 20th century, 1939. He says, for the first time, we have concerts where every single composer is dead, right? That never used to happen. When Beethoven was alive, you played Beethoven. And then in the late 1800s, you played Brahms, and Brahms was sitting in the audience. It was in the 20th century. You would show up, and it would be like a museum, right? The more critical way to say that is some people say it resembles a tomb, right? So how do we keep the orchestra still modern, you know, still relevant in the 20th and now even the 21st centuries? He was very concerned about this, right? It bothered him that his music was getting beat out by people who were no longer alive, right? I think we're in a little bit of a different place. We're almost 100 years out from that book, right? How often, in the age of technology and all this time, do we take the time to look back and learn from the past? I think the orchestra affords us that chance. So I think MCE is doing it exactly right. For a majority of our season, you will hear a still living composer, a female composer, a minority voice that doesn't get played enough. But every once in a while, we should show up and learn from the past. And today, in the best sense of the word, is a museum. So I hope I've given that a little bit more context. All right, let's jump into the music. I'm going to go a little out of order. I want to just jump into the Beethoven because we're about to hear, like, without exaggeration, one of the greatest pieces of music ever written. Right? Beethoven wrote 5 piano concertos. This is his 5th one. It's his most famous. So we're talking about, you know, the most famous composer ever alive, the greatest pianist probably to ever live, his best concerto. You're going to hear some just insane piano playing. John Livingston is just unbelievable. I was missing some entrances in rehearsal because I was just like, how is he doing this? So you're going to absolutely love it. It was written in 1811. This is in the middle of Beethoven's life. We, when I say we, like historians, divide Beethoven's life into 3 sections. And that's a really good thing to do, but there's an evolution that occurs. And all 3 sections of Beethoven's life are present in this concerto. So like if you think like early Beethoven, he's just kind of doing what Mozart and Haydn did, but in his own way. And the way that you can do that is the first movement of this concerto is the exact same way Mozart would write a concerto. But for one difference, it is way longer. The first movement is almost 20 minutes, right? It's almost an entire symphony in one movement. So that's kind of Beethoven saying, I'm doing what the guys before me did. It's going to feel familiar, but it's going to be on a time scale that no one really imagined before. Like an entire Mozart symphony is 20 minutes. This is one movement of a concerto, right? So that's early Beethoven, right? We call the middle period the heroic period. because it started with the Third Symphony, which is nicknamed the Heroic Symphony. So we call that entire period of his life the heroic period. What does heroic mean? It means he was defying your expectations. If you think of yourself as an audience member in 1811, you went to a lot of concerts and you expected it to go a certain way, right? You knew, I hear a primary theme, then there's a transition, then I hear a secondary theme, then I hear this giant development where they do a bunch of stuff, and then it all comes back at the end. Like you expected all that. And Beethoven said, I'm going to defy all of those expectations. And that, we call that heroic, the heroic period of the middle. It's also very like, this is concerto's nicknamed the Emperor Concerto. It is, it's got royal qualities, lots of dotted rhythms, marches that you can imagine, and then also the length of it, right? That is how I come to see how that nickname becomes qualified, right? You'll hear pomp and circumstance in this piece, right, in terms of the royal aspect of it. But the thing that's my favorite, late Beethoven, right? The absolute genius who changed music forever, late Beethoven when he's deaf, right? The Ninth Symphony, the late string quartets, the thing we consider like sacred in music. Because that's so good and happened so late in his life, we section it off. But it did not come from nothing. The second movement of this piano concerto, it doesn't get better, right? It's stunning music. In my opinion, the greatest contribution Beethoven made to music is he chiseled the Romantic era from a classical marble. So capital C classical era is this giant marble, and he chiseled it into the Romantic era. And the second movement is the beginning of Romanticism, in my opinion. It's a very romantic movement. Long, beautiful melodies, right? Complex harmonies. So even though this is from the heroic period, it's got a classical structure, it's got romantic music, and it's super heroic. So in that way, all three periods of Beethoven's life is an evolution in one piece. And I can't wait to play for you guys. The whole orchestra, it's going to be and John is just amazing. It's going to be fantastic. All right. So we'll go to the first half of the concert now. Thank you for letting me do this a little bit out of order. The concert's going to begin by a piece with Claude Debussy. I said this is a concert of the piano, right? Both pieces, both the French pieces on the first half were originally written for piano. I think when we think of Debussy, we think orchestra, and then we think opera. It's not as often spoken about how much he wrote for solo piano. Like when all of the people on stage here were in music school, we study his solo piano compositions in great detail. The most famous one is the Sunken Cathedral. You've probably heard of that. If you have not, I encourage, go type that into YouTube and listen to it. It's like a little bit longer than 5 minutes. It's totally worth it. A beautiful piece for solo piano. This Sarabande is another one. Another one of the pieces he wrote for solo piano. What's really wonderful is how you'll hear it from the very beginning. The first thing you hear is in the back row woodwinds. We all play the same rhythm, but the harmonies are really complex and just gorgeous. So what he does is he kind of like takes away an element. I'm not going to do anything fancy with rhythm, and I'm going to really beef up the harmonies, the volumes. And that happens throughout, where you can imagine two hands on the piano being, boom, an entire orchestra. Orchestration, orchestrated from two hands into 40 people. We're all often playing the same rhythm, right? You can imagine the two hands moving at the same time in the same way. And it's the harmonies that make it interesting. I think that's really sensitive composing. I'm not a composer at all, but I talk to composers. I think their minds are unbelievable. And they say it's easy to put way too much in, right? Because you get excited. It's like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. So when a composer as genius as Debussy takes the time to do less, I think he's really trying to teach us something. So listen for that. Listen to how the orchestra moves in the same way, right? It's a very short piece, and then we'll move on to Ravel's Mother Goose Suite. What do you do with a piece like Mother Goose Suite? So just by the name, right? I was in an orchestra once, a couple years ago, and we were playing Daphnis and Chloe, right, Ravel's masterpiece, and the conductor stopped the orchestra and he was just like, Ravel is God. And I was like, yeah, Ravel, like his music is like heavenly. It's like lowercase g, obviously. But like, I thought that worked. Mother Goose Suite, if like Daphnis and Chloe is like Zeus throwing lightning bolts, This is like Cupid, you know, telling little cute stories. This is that type of Ravel. It's similar to like early Beethoven, when he was writing short chamber pieces that don't get played much anymore. This is a shorter piece of Ravel's, not his giant masterpiece that the Kansas City Symphony plays almost every single year, right? It still exists, it's still wonderful music, and I'm glad we get to hear it. It was written for 2 children, piano, 4 hands. So just as we're playing it, I want you to imagine 2 little children sitting at a piano playing this music, right? He then orchestrated it for, you know, a 40-person orchestra. Again, similar to the Debussy, I think the first half of the program, what it's trying to teach us, what these French guys are trying to teach us is that, you know, when you take a complex idea and distill it down to something simple, that is like a good definition of education. So I think they're just trying to teach us that, and if you'll permit the analogy, it's kind of like when you're cooking and you use less ingredients and it turns out better. I think that's what's going on here. Similar to how Debussy is taking away some rhythm to make the harmonies more interesting. Ravel, you can follow every note, which if you know Daphnis and Chloe or La Valse or some of the bigger pieces, you cannot follow every note. It's like a wash of sound. In this piece, you can follow almost every note. It's a simple melody and accompaniment. Maybe a third thing going on. If there's a third thing going on, it's the most complex part of the piece. And that's very, I don't want to say watered down, but pared down on purpose for Ravel. He's cooking with minimal ingredients on purpose.